Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again. Hopefully you are enjoying this series. This is section 2 or part 2 of my 8-week series on the change leader model, which is part of my new book, hopefully coming out in December, called Your Journey to Becoming a Great Change Leader. And so this is session 2, like I said, and I'm very glad that you're here, glad that you have joined us today. And so today we want to continue what we started last week. And last week, if you remember, we just kind of touched on a little introduction about the book and what the change leader model is. And so today we're going to jump into a little more detail, and hopefully you'll get some things out of this that can help you. Number one, just help your organization be more successful at initiating change. We talked last week about the fact that 70% of all change initiatives fail, and it's hard to imagine that for the past 25 years, since we've really started tracking the success and failure rate of change initiatives, we really haven't moved the needle on that 70% failure rate at all. And so hopefully this will help you and your organization to be a little more successful when it comes time to change in your organization, to go through organizational change. But hopefully it'll help you as well. Hopefully this will be instrumental in helping you become a better leader, not just in your organization, but maybe even in your family or in your community. And so we talked last week about the change leader model, and the change leader model actually has 4 components to it. And I hope you don't mind, I'm actually standing up today. It's a little easier for me to kind of get engaged in the process, and this is more comfortable for me. So I'm standing up today. Hopefully this doesn't distract you or whatever. But we talked a little bit about the change leader model. And if you remember, the 4 components of the change leader model are change readiness, change management, change communication, and change sustainability. So today we want to kind of pick up where we left off. We were talking about change readiness. And if you remember, change readiness or the change readiness piece to the change leader model really has 3 components of its own. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, are you ready? And if you remember, we talked a little bit about the lessons we learned from a flight attendant. When we fly, before the plane ever takes off, before it ever leaves the ground, the flight attendants get together and they go through this safety protocol where they tell you what to do in case of emergency, remember? And so when you're hearing that, and I've flown so many times I can kind of recite this from memory, but when the flight attendants are going through this safety protocol, they tell you that in the unlikely event that the cabin loses pressure and there's no oxygen, oxygen masks will fall from the cabin above you, from the compartment above you. And what do they always tell you to do? Right? They always tell you, put your own mask on first and then help those around you. Because if you can't breathe, if you can't function, if you're not well, if you're not prepared, then you cannot help those around you. And it's the same thing with change leadership. The first component of the change readiness is whether you as the leader are ready. So how do you know? How do you know if you as a leader are ready to lead people through change? Well, I have 5 questions for you to ask yourself. The first question is, what is your vulnerability factor? Now, what do I mean by that? What's a vulnerability factor? Well, I believe that the trait of a great leader is to be vulnerable. We've grown up in a kind of a world, especially if you're in my generation or even Gen X, we've kind of been taught our whole lives that to admit that you're wrong and to ask for help is a sign of weakness. And if you do that, then your people won't trust you. They won't have confidence in you. And quite frankly, the opposite is really true. It's when you can become vulnerable, when you can show some vulnerability, and when you can show people that you maybe don't have all the answers all the time. Or when you have the ability to say, you know what, I like your answer better. I like your suggestion better. You don't have to be right all the time, and it doesn't have to be your way or the highway. What is your vulnerability factor? Do you feel comfortable saying to somebody, you know what, I screwed up. I'm sorry. I just thought it would work. It didn't work. I apologize. Or to say to someone, like I said, you know what, I like your idea better. Let's go with that one. So, what is your vulnerability factor? The second question, do you set clear goals for your team? Does your team know exactly what's expected of them? Do they know what that new state looks like? Because remember, change is going from the old state to the new state, right? So do they know what that new state looks like? Do they have a clear idea? Do they have a clear vision of what that goal looks like? Do they know what their role in that vision is for themselves? Does each member of your team know exactly what's expected of them? So do you set clear goals for your team? And another part of that question is, and do those goals that you set for your team, do they align with the goals of the organization? Because if they don't, then you're really going to be sending a lot of mixed messages. And mixed messages can really kind of derail a change initiative. So let me give you an example. So you have this goal, you have this objective of driving a safety culture within your organization so that you have zero lost time incidents, no workers' comp accidents, nobody gets hurt. Your goal is to have zero incidents. But then one of your high profile customers says, we need this delivery tomorrow, or else we're going to find somebody else to do our business. So now, you've got this goal of safety that you're not going to cut corners, you're not going to do anything that would jeopardize the safety and health of your people. But now all of a sudden your backs are up against the wall and you've got this deadline to meet. So what do? Do you say to your people, you know what, we got to get this out no matter what the cost, no matter what corners we have to cut, no matter what we have to do, this delivery has to go out at all costs? Or do we keep our focus on that safety goal and say, we're going to do our very best to get this order out the door, but we're not going to compromise on our safety? So you want to make sure that the goals that you set for your organization and the goals that you set for your team align with the overall goals of the organization. Third question, do you follow up regularly with your team? And what I mean by that is, when you provide this clear direction, when you provide these goals and objectives, and they know their roles in the organization, do you follow up with them on a regular basis? Or do you do what a lot of managers do? You give them that direction, and then you go to your office, close the door, and you never to be seen again for another week or so. So let me ask you to think of it from a different perspective. Instead of answering the question, do you follow up regularly with your team? Ask yourself this: if you give your team clear direction, if you give your team a clear understanding of what their role is, and then maybe a day later, 2 days later, you're out there, you're talking to them, you're finding out what their objectives are, or what their roadblocks are, what their difficulties, what they're having. You're getting feedback from them on what's going on. If you do that, are your employees going to say, whoa, what's up with the boss? He never comes out and talks to us. He just, usually goes to his office and sits there, and if we have a problem, we have to go, knock on his door and find an answer. So ask yourself, if I did follow up regularly with my team, would my team be surprised? Number four, are you consistently positive? Now, I get it. Being positive all the time is hard. At least it is for me. And I think some people, the default naturally is to be positive, and there's those people that are always positive and looking on the positive side of things, or maybe they just work really hard at it. For a lot of us, the default is negative. When things don't go as we planned, when things don't happen the way we think they should, we kind of default to that negative, and we all of a sudden are frustrated, and we show our frustration among our team, and of course then that becomes um, what the team sees, and so that is what the team does. Your team will kind of mimic how you react to things. Now, I always say positivity is a force multiplier. And what I mean by that is if you can remain positive, and if you can find the positive in whatever is going on, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's indifferent, whatever it is, if you can find a positive outcome, if you can find a positive thing to latch onto, even in a negative scenario, your people are going to adapt that positivity themselves. And positive people just produce more. It's just the way it is. But if you can consistently remain positive and continue to look for that positive lesson, even in negative times, then your people are going to be that way too, and you're going to have a much more productive team. And then the last question, are you open and approachable? So we're asking the first part of the change readiness thing, are you ready? Right? So are you open and approachable? Of course, we always talk about leaders having this open door policy. And what does that even mean? Are you open and are you approachable? Meaning, when your team does have to come to you, and when they have to come to you with a problem, when they have to come to you to tell you they screwed up, or when they have to come to you saying that something failed and didn't go as planned, do they know that you have their back? Do they know that they can come to you and deliver that message without fear of reprisal or retaliation? Or do they shudder and kind of get nervous and, man, I have to go to the boss and tell them this didn't work, and they become anxious, kind of like being sent to the principal's office. And trust me, as a teacher and principal for 15 years, I know exactly what that feels like from both ends. So it's not fun when an employee has to kind of put their tail between their legs and have to knock on the boss's door, your door, and give you some bad news. But if you can, again, remain consistently positive, be open and approachable to them, and look for the challenge, look for the learning lesson to be learned in that scenario, and then move forward, then your team will be more likely, more apt to bring you their problems because they know they're not going to get beat up for it. Colin Powell, who used to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, um, used to say he had his principles of leadership. And one of his principles was that the day that your soldiers stop bringing you their problems is the day you stopped leading them. And so your people need to know that if they do have to come to you with problems, if they do have to come to you with failures, that you're not going to beat them up for it. As a matter of fact, a really great leader is not only going to not beat you up for failing, they're going to encourage you to fail. Because only when you fail do you test the boundaries of what's possible. And so that's how you know that you're ready for change. Are you ready for change? What's your vulnerability factor? Do you set clear goals for your team? Do you follow up on a regular basis? Are you consistently positive? And are you open and approachable? So the second part of change readiness, not only do you ask yourself, are you ready, you as the leader, but is your organization ready? Is your organization ready for change? And by the way, when I say your organization, that could be your big organization, the company itself, or it could be as small as a department or even smaller as a team. Maybe it's just a project team. But is your organization, however big or small that is your organization ready for change? And so the first thing that will answer that question, you have to ask yourself, is the leadership of the organization bought in? Are they fully invested in this change? Because if leadership isn't bought in fully, and it's got to be more than just, yeah, you know what, go ahead, try that, see if it works. If not, then, no big deal, uh, no harm, no foul kind of thing. But they have to be excited and they have to be bought into the change, because here's what's going to happen. If they're not fully invested, if they're not fully bought into the change, then as soon as something goes south, they're out. They've pulled their resources, they've pulled the budget, they pulled their support for the project, and now it's just doomed to fail. So you have to make sure that the leadership is fully bought into the change initiative. So how do you get their buy-in? How do you even talk to people in the C-suite, the CEO, and the CFO? Well, I've always taught people that when you talk to executive leadership, you have to talk their language. It's so critical that you speak their language. And what's their language? Usually, CEOs, CFOs, all the C-suite people, their language is numbers. They understand numbers. They understand statistics. They, throw in a chart or a graph or two. Those always seem to be received well. But they care about the bottom line. And if you can show them with statistics and true numbers that this change initiative will have a positive impact on the bottom line, you've got them. They're bought in. But if you give them, puppy dogs and rainbows and all this other stuff, all this intangible benefit, they're probably not going to buy into the change initiative. So you have to speak their language. So leadership has to be totally bought in. Number two, you have to figure out what your company's culture is. So what do I mean by company culture? Believe it or not, companies actually have a culture of their own, just like ethnic groups do, just like nations do, just like, groups of people have a culture. Organizations have a culture too. And it's up to you to figure out what your company's culture is. And is it a positive culture or is it a negative culture? If you're a sales organization and your culture is to make the sale at all costs, regardless of what you have to do, or whatever it takes to get the sale, then that could be looked at as a negative culture. So you have to kind of determine what your company culture is. Do you have a culture of trust within your organization? When your leadership announces new things, when they ask people to go above and beyond or whatever, is there a trust factor there that helps people embrace those changes, embrace those new things so that you can move forward? So you have to figure out what your company culture is. And sometimes that means that you have to do what's called a culture audit. You have to ask questions about the culture. And remember, the culture isn't something that you're going to find in the employee handbook. It's not a written policy. It's not, something that you could look up in a book or a notebook somewhere and say, okay, here's the section on company culture. Company culture has been defined rather loosely in a lot of ways, but one of the best ways that I've found to define company culture is it's the way we do things around here. Again, it's not written down anywhere, but it's just how people behave on a day-to-day basis. It's not the corporate values, it's not the, all those things that you see written on a plaque in the lobby somewhere, but it's actually how people live the values of the organization on a day-to-day basis. And so a culture audit will help you to determine what your company's culture is. And again, if your company doesn't have a culture of trust, then you need to start developing that culture of trust. If there's no culture of change, then you need to start developing a culture of change. Now, you don't have to necessarily get all the way there to start a change initiative, but you have to be on the road to developing those positive cultures within your organization. The next thing you need to ask yourself to determine whether your organization is ready is, do we have the infrastructure capabilities necessary for the new state? Sometimes change requires new software, new hardware, new skills for your people. Could be new policies, new procedures. All of that is included in the infrastructure of your organization that you have to look at to make sure that your company is ready for change. And then look at the pace of change. Has your company gone through or undergone constant change lately? Has there been a lot of recent change initiatives? Has the pace of change in your organization just been at breakneck speed? If so, then what we call change fatigue may have set in with your people. Change fatigue is what happens to people when change comes at them so fast that they feel like they're drinking out of a fire hose sometimes. And so every time a new change initiative is announced by the leadership, the people are like, oh man, here we go again. I don't know if I can take another change initiative. And the best way to find out whether or not the pace has been too quickly, talk to your people, ask them, find out, just say, you know what, here, we're thinking about a new change, what do you think? And if their reaction is, oh man, are you kidding me, another one? Then, maybe it's time to put the brakes on. Maybe it's time to step back a little bit and just wait. Let your employees take a deep breath. Let them kind of enjoy the success from the last change initiative, if it was successful. Let them just kind of revel in that for a little while and then introduce your change later. Because if you just keep throwing change at your people become change fatigued, which means that they become disengaged. That means their productivity declines, their job satisfaction declines, and it just kind of all goes downhill from there. So find out what the pace of change in your organization has been, and if you need to put the brakes on, put the brakes on. Another question you should ask yourself to determine whether your organization is ready is, do you have the right mix on your team? The right mix of people. You say, Tim, what do you mean by that? What's the right mix of people? Well, we talk a lot in business today about diversity and inclusion, right? When we think of diversity in our organizations, we think, our mind kind of goes to those default characteristics when we think about diversity, right? Diversity of race, diversity of color, ethnicity, gender, religion, all of those, things that we tend to think of when we think of diversity. And yes, it's extremely important to have diversity of all those things in our organization and among our teams. But really what I'm talking about is a diversity of thought. You can have two people, the same race, same gender, come from the same area of the country, that have two totally different outlooks on life because their experience has been different. They've come up through the ranks differently, and so they think differently. So you want to have a diversity of thought. And one of the best ways I've found to do that is to think about right brain versus left brain. Now, we've all kind of heard, this taught and used about right brain people versus left brain people. And if you've done any of those, surveys like Myers-Briggs type indicators and DISC assessments and things like that, that those start basically on the premise of right brain versus left brain. So if you've never heard this before, which I'm sure you all have, but just for the sake of argument, if you've never heard this before, right brain people are people that tend to be more creative. They don't think of things in a linear progression. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Right brain people, they're kind of all over the place because that's the way they think. They look at things holistically instead of individual components. Whereas left brain people, they're more numbers driven, statistical driven. They are the linear ones. They're the ones that are step 1, step 2, step 3. And so if I asked you to identify yourself as either left-brained or right-brained, what would you say? Now, before you answer, keep in mind that nobody is 100% left-brained or 100% right-brained. We all use all of our brain, and even the most left-brained people can be creative, and even the most right-brained people can think linearly. But if I ask you that question, do you consider yourself right-brained? Do you consider yourself left-brained? What would your answer be? And then the next question is, Which is better? Is it better to have more right brain people than left brain, or more left brain people than right brain? Well, I think you know that the answer to that is there is one is not better than the other. The important piece is that when you have a team, especially if you're a leader of a group, it's so critical to have a good mix of right brain and left brain people on your team, because then when you sit down in a team meeting together, when you have a project to accomplish, when you have a challenge that you need to overcome, everybody thinks of different ways to solve that problem or attack that problem. You're taking a decision and you're vetting it from every possible angle. And when your team makes a decision, you know exactly what that decision is, and it's a good decision because you have looked at it from every angle. Probably the best right brain, left brain team illustration that I can give you today is Walt and Roy Disney. Now, everybody knows Walt Disney, right? He's the creator of Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie back in the late 1920s, I believe, 1929 maybe. He was the creative one. He was the guy with the pen and paper that made inanimate objects come to life. He was the creative one that had the vision of all that he could create with his artistic ability. But when it came to putting that artistic ability and monetizing it and making things like Disneyland in California and Walt Disney World in Florida, he had no idea what to do. Luckily, his brother Roy Disney was very left-brained. Walt was the right-brain guy. Roy was the left-brain guy. As a matter of fact, he was a banker by trade, and so he knew the finances, he knew the numbers. He was the numbers cruncher guy that knew how to take the vision of Walt and make it reality. As a matter of fact, about a year before Walt Disney World opened in Florida, Walt Disney, Roy Disney, and their financier from Orlando sat down at lunch together one day, and the financier looked at Walt Disney and he said, "Walt, if you get hit by a bus tomorrow and die, what's going to happen to this project?" And Walt Disney looked him right in the eye and he said, "Absolutely nothing." He said, "Roy, my brother Roy, he's the guy that's going to make it happen." He said, "Me, I just piddle around with paper and pencil. That's all I do." And so little did they know, Walt Disney was actually sick. He was dying of cancer. And 2 months later, Walt Disney was dead. And that Walt Disney World project finished on time, under budget, and we now know that the Disney empire is what it is today. So without Walt Disney, there would have never been a Disney empire because we needed that creative aspect. But without Roy Disney getting it done, crunching the numbers, getting the finances together and making it happen, we wouldn't have that either. So it's the right brain, left brain combination that truly makes a great team. And then real quickly, we've talked about, are you ready? We've talked about, is your organization ready? What about your people? Are your people ready for change? We already talked a little bit about change fatigue. Are your people fatigued? Do you need to put the brakes on and wait a little while? Do your people have the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to be successful in the new state? Remember, we said that change is going from the old state to the new state. And in that new state, many times we have to develop new skills and new knowledge to be successful in that new state. Do your people have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, or what we call KSAs? Do they have the KSAs necessary to be successful in that new state? If they don't, you may need to start training people. You may need to start looking for new people that have those skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then, do they understand the change initiative? Have you provided clear goals and clear objectives for them to where they understand what that new state is all about? Do they know what the new state looks like? And do they know what role they play in that new state? If they don't, you may have to go back and start re-communicating some of that message to them. And then not only do they understand it, do they believe in it? Do they believe in the plan? Do they believe that this is a great thing for the organization? One of the things that keeps employees from really believing in the plan is because we leave them out of the planning process altogether. Now, I know we can't have the whole organization involved in the planning process when we do change initiatives, but it's important to take a good cross-reference or a cross-section of the organization and bring them into the planning session, people at every level, whether it's hourly, entry level, skilled labor, managers, supervisors, leads, whatever it is. You get a good cross section of people from your organization and bring them into the planning session so that you have everyone represented, everyone involved in that planning session, so that when you make a final decision, when you leave that planning session and you have a change plan in place, everybody can go out and support it, even if it wasn't their idea, even if some components of that plan are things that they didn't necessarily agree with. They will buy into it and they will support it because they were part of the planning process. And so it's so critical that you involve people from every part of your organization in that planning process. So are you ready? Is your organization ready? And are your people ready? I want to thank you for joining me today. Our time is up, but join me back here for part 3 next Monday at 4 o'clock, and we'll keep going and talk about change management, change leadership. Until then, have a great day, and I hope you guys have a great week. Take care.